For the first part of this class, we're going to focus on formal elements, or moving from the form of a text into some kind of interpretation. So we're going to start with this poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar called Sympathy. The first thing I'm going to do is read it out loud. Poetry was written to be read out loud. It's intended that way. There's a lot that you can hear that you might not be able to read. So I encourage you, as you go through all of the poems that we're about to read them out loud. And actually, I recommend reading them out loud and recording it and then listening to it, because sometimes you can hear things, as I mentioned before, that you can't see. So let's begin. Sympathy. I know what the caged bird feels, alas, when the sun is bright on the upland slopes, when the wind stirs soft through the springing grass and the river flows like a stream of glass, when the first bird sings and the first bud opes and the faint perfume from its chalice steals, I know what the caged bird feels. I know why the caged bird beats his wing till its blood is red on the cruel bars, for he must fly back to his perch and cling when he fain would be on the bough a swing. And a pain still throbs in the old, old scars, and they pulse again with a keener sting. I know why he beats his wing. I know why the caged bird sings, ah me, when his wing is bruised and his bosom sore, when he beats his bars and he would be free. It is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why the caged bird sings. So I'm sure there were a couple of things you noticed as I was reading it in terms of where I was pausing and what I was emphasizing, but I want to start by first taking a bigger picture look at this. This poem is a type of poem called a lyric. Lyric poems are poems that are written from the perspective of the speaker and say something about their emotional state or their internal state. So in this case, the speaker of this poem, we kind of know it's a lyric because it begins with I, right? And even though the subject of the poem is this caged bird, the focus of the poem is the connection between the speaker and the bird, the speaker's seeming sympathy or understanding for what the caged bird is feeling. So one thing to note in poetry, when we talk about who wrote the poem, the poet wrote it, but the I of the poem we refer to as the speaker, right? They're not necessarily the same thing. So it's either the speaker or the persona. And so one of the questions that you can ask about a poem is, why did the poet choose this particular kind of speaker, right? Why would Paul Laurence Dunbar write from the perspective of somebody who can sympathize so closely with a caged bird? All right, so though it is a lyric poem, it is also written with a kind of closed form, in that there's a clear structure to it. And we're not going to spend too much time looking at things like meter right now. We'll talk about that later. But there is a kind of regularity to it, right? And so you can actually see it pretty visually. There are 7 lines and 3 stanzas. So a lot of what we'll be talking about in the first couple of poems is how the poet uses lineation, or how they divide lines. And so the other thing to look at is the form. And in this case, you have 3 very regular 7-line stanzas. And then within each stanza, there is a particular rhyme scheme, right? So in this case, when we're indicating rhyme scheme, you're basically just connecting the different sounds that get repeated. So you do that by using the letters of the alphabet. So the first sound is always A, right? Alas is how this ends. Slopes doesn't rhyme with alas, so you use a new letter. But grass does. So we go back to A, and then the same in this line. And then you can see opes rhymes with slopes, so we come with another B. And then we have a new sound, C, right? Steals and feels. The next stanza, you can continue using the exact same letters, or you can start back from the beginning, depending on what you're trying to discover. But we can see that each of these uses its own particular rhyme scheme. So I'm just going to continue with the letters, and we'll say wing is a new sound, so it gets a D. Bars is also a new sound, it gets an E. And then you can see D, E, right? No, I'm sorry, D. And then we have another E, scars and bars. Sting goes back to D. And then here we have wing, right? So in this one, the form is slightly different, where here we have A, B, A, B, C, C. Here we have D, E, D, D, E, D, D. So it's actually an even more regular rhyme scheme here, right? And so to continue, the next line, or the next line ends with me, which is a new sound, so we would introduce a new letter, F, and then we have G here for soar, me and free rhyme, so we use F again, glee and free rhyme, and then we have another G sound, core, and then flings and sings, and this actually goes back to the previous stanza. So if you wanted to, here you could indicate that with D, although flings and sting is slightly different, so you could also, if you wanted to, use H. And so the purpose of doing this is not to be exact, but to figure out why is the writer connecting these different words through rhyme, right? And rhyme does something, and you can hear this in music. When a line of a song ends and it rhymes, it focuses our attention on that last word. And when there's an interrupted rhyme, or a line doesn't rhyme in a way that you expect, it's always a little discordant. So here we have him using rhyme scheme to create a very regular and actually kind of confining structure, right? So one of the things that you might say if you were analyzing this poem is, oh, here we have this poem about a caged bird, and the form or the structure of the poem is also very confining, right? So that's the connection that you start making as you move from observation to interpretation. Okay, so a couple of other things that I want to look at are the images in the poem, right? And so the most obvious image is that of the caged bird. And if you were to do an analysis of this poem, if you were to interpret it, you would obviously be focusing on the ways in which the speaker of the poem identifies with a caged bird, right? And what does that mean, right? Why is this image of the caged bird so important? So that's certainly a central image or motif, but then you also have all of these other really, really strong natural images. And images are just anything that you can kind of see in a poem, right? So here we have the sun, it's bright on upland slopes, the wind stirs soft through the springing grass, the river flows like a stream of glass. When the first bird sings, now this is a different bird, obviously, than the one that is caged, and the first bud opes, and the faint perfume from its chalice steals, right? So now all of these natural images are images of things that are free, right? The river's flowing, the wind is stirring, the first bird is singing, the first bird is opening, and these are in contrast to the caged bird, right? But what he's doing here is he's showing us all of these free images as a way of contrasting. So that's an important thing to pay attention to is imagery. Another thing that we see a lot is repetition. And so he does this in a couple of ways. We get this, I know what the caged bird gets repeated, right? Here, I know what the caged bird, I know why the caged bird. So there is here this kind of repetition that is almost like, I want to call it like in a song when you have a chorus, it keeps repeating, but it's also a little bit of what's called anaphora, and that's the repetition of similar words at the beginning of subsequent phrases. And we'll see this a lot in poetry. You also see it a lot in speeches. So if you think of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, it's based on anaphora, right? This idea of I have a dream that, I have a dream that. And by repeating it, it creates a very sermon-like quality, of course, but it also allows you to see when there is variation, right? So we go from I know what the caged bird feels, right, and that's repeated here. I know why the caged bird beats his wing. And so when you have an afro, when you have any kind of repetition, what's important to look for are the variations, right? How is he repeating things, but how is he changing it? And then those subtle changes are usually clues into some kind of meaning or progression. So in this case, we go from knowing what the caged bird feels, knowing why the caged bird beats his wing, to I know why the caged bird sings, right? So this is slightly different. And one thing you might do in an analysis is look at how these repetitions are slightly different and what that means, right? Because we go from a kind of sympathy of just feeling to an understanding of why this caged bird, in spite of its caging, continues to sing, right? And we get some of that clarification here. Okay, a couple of other just formal things I want to look at. There's alliteration. There's a lot of it, right? So alliteration is the repetition of sounds at the beginning of subsequent words or words that are close together. So we have things like when wind, and then stirs soft springing. And so part of the reason that authors do that is to draw our attention to things, but it also creates a very rhythmic, melodic quality to the writing, right? You can hear it when I'm speaking, and when I was reading it out loud. And so in this case, that often here in this stanza, the alliteration is meant to draw our attention to this beauty and this freedom. Whereas when we get down here and we get beats his bars. The repetition here, and also bruised and bosom sore. Here we get a much clearer sense of the confinement. Right, so in that case, the alliteration is drawing our attention to the pain of the bird. And we also have prayer, plea, and those kinds of things, drawing a contrast between the horrible condition of this bird on earth and its desire for freedom in heaven. Okay, the last thing that I want to look at, and I talked about this a little bit before, but I want to look at lineation. And that just means how the lines are structured and how they're broken up. So you'll notice when I was reading, when you read a poem, you only stop reading when the poet tells you to. So that's when there's punctuation, right? If there's punctuation at the end of a line, it's called end stopping, right? Which is really easy. So here, the exclamation point, the semicolon, those are pretty hard stops. Whereas commas, you might pause a little, but you don't stop as much. And here, if you have no punctuation at the end of the line, you just keep reading, right? And that's called enjambment. And again, we'll talk more about this stuff as we go on. And what enjambment does is it can create a kind of breathless quality. So if you notice when I was reading here, for here he must fly back to his perch and cling when he fain would be on the bough a swing. It becomes almost difficult to read, and it creates much more momentum. So that then when you get to this dash here, which you'll notice there's a dash in the penultimate line of each stanza, that stops you dead in the middle of a line. Or in the middle of reading this, and that's a hard pause, like a period would be, or an exclamation point. Right, so that's a really, really hard instance of end stopping, and then we get this culminating line, right? So there's here in that pause, you're forced to go from these really, really brilliant images to the conclusion, right? Which is what makes this a lyric poem. It makes the focus is not on the bird beating its wings or the bird singing, but it's on the speaker's awareness of what that means, right? And this here, this hard break, is a moment where we are forced to reconcile with that. And Dunbar really leaves us in that moment. Okay, there's another thing about lineation that has to do with caesura, but he doesn't use that at all in this poem, so we'll talk about it later. Okay, so I've given you a couple of what I think are helpful websites for looking at literary terms, and there are links on this page. So one is Literary Devices, and this tells you all about lyric poems in this case, but you can search for any of these terms. And then there's also this literary term site that's really great. And this is in alphabetical order. So if you're looking for things like enjambment or end stopping, you can find them there. Okay, so those are our observations about the forms, right? So how would we go from this to a kind of thesis about it? Well, a really formulaic way to do this would be to just say in the poem Sympathy by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and you always want to make sure that you spell everything right. He uses, and then, for your formal analysis essay, I'm going to ask you to use 3 kinds of literary elements. But you could say he uses repetition, rhyme, and let's say imagery too, right? So here we go from the literary elements to your analysis, right? To portray the speaker's awareness, or let's just say connection to the plight of the caged bird. Right, and then in each of your paragraphs, you would unpack that a little bit, right? So you might have a paragraph on repetition, and you'd provide examples from the poem where he's using repetition, then a paragraph on rhyme where you develop that, and a paragraph on imagery, right? And over the next couple of classes, we're going to go over how to do that. Okay, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or put them in the discussion at the end of the module. All right, thanks, and I will talk to you again soon.